Great. Okay. Thank you for joining us. Our next speaker is our own organizer, who's going to speak about iterated determination.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks for coming. Very happy that this thing is happening. I'm not a very ceremonial person, so this is about the most elevated that comes to mind. So I'm going to talk about, as the title says, iterated determination. And the best way to introduce this question is through the much more well-known question of iterated grounding. So the question of iterated grounding goes like this. Take two facts, such as the fact that A and the fact that B, and suppose that the fact that A grounds the fact that B. Question, what grounds the fact that A grounds the fact that B? And this question is widely considered problematic in a way, or shedding light on certain problematic aspects of grounding theory. There are at least two ways to highlight what the problematic aspect is. One of them came up, for example, in Shlomit's talk about purity. So grounding facts, according to this first way of problematizing, grounding facts connect, at least among other things, non-fundamental facts to fundamental ones. So if you want to give a story of the world and about how everything is somehow based on a fundamental, one way to tell the story is that derivative aspects of reality are grounded in the fundamental. Purity is the principle that every constituent of a fundamental fact must itself be fundamental. So every property in the individual that features in such a fact must be fundamental. If that's the case, the worry goes, then the grounding facts themselves cannot be fundamental, because the grounding facts are about how non-fundamental aspects of reality are grounded in the fundamental, or at least more fundamental aspects, and at least the non-fundamental sides of the relation that seems non-fundamental. So the grounding facts themselves cannot be fundamental either. They need to be grounded in something else. But of course, that grounding itself is a grounding fact that also needs to be grounded in something, and you get this infinite regress. And another way to problematize the issue, and this was also touched upon in Tobias's talk in a different context, but it came up a bit, is that grounding is also often used to formulate general level connecting theses. So if you want to formulate one of these very ambitious sweeping theories of a certain portion of reality, for example, physicalism, let's say physicalism, or naturalism, whatever that is. But I should add, it also applies to things like idealism. It's on the face of it, it's appealing to formulate these theses in ground theoretic terms. So you might want to say that physicalism is the view that everything is either physical or grounded. Every fact is either physical or grounded in physical facts. Maybe idealism can be formulated as the view that every fact is mental, or it's grounded in mental facts, and so on and so forth. And on the face of it, there seems to be a problem for these ground theoretic formulations of these level connecting theses, which Dasgupta demonstrates with the case of the physical. Suppose that indeed every fact is either physical or grounded in physical facts. Then we can ask the question, what's the status of the grounding facts themselves? So suppose you take some mental facts, supposedly it's grounded in a physical fact. What's the status of this fact that the mental fact in question is grounded in a physical fact? It doesn't seem to be physical, because it has this non-physical constituent. So it doesn't have to be physical in its own right. If it's physical, it has to be because it's grounded in something physical. But if it's grounded in something physical, you can again ask the same question about the groundedness of these grounding facts concerning the mental and the physical. What is that grounded in? And again, you get an infinite regress. So I'm not trying to say anything new about this problem. It's widely considered I should say right away before I move on, I refrain from using the word vicious when I talk about regresses. I don't know what that means. I don't know what the word vicious means. It seems like there's a regress, and it seems like philosophers should say something about it. Vicious seems like this. It seems like this, I don't know, fighting word. Like it's really bad, and you won't solve it. There's always something smart to say. So I'm not going to say vicious. It seems like there's a problem. Now, what I'm really interested in is a generalization of this iterated grounding question, because it's widely thought that grounding is just one member of a larger family of determination relations, which varyingly have been called building relations, to use Karen Bennett's terminology, or maybe small g grounding relations, as Jessica Wilson calls them. To just give an incomplete list of the sorts of relations that are at issue, material constitution is often considered one of these determination relations. Composition is a strong candidate. Functional realization, especially, but not only in the philosophy of mind. The determinable relation, which came up a bit in the Q&A after Doran's talk. And more controversially, sometimes things like causation, truth-making, emergence are also considered determination relations. And what's common to these relations is that they seem to impose some kind of hierarchy on the structure of reality. This is often phrased by assuming that these are irreflexive and asymmetric relations, although that's not completely consensus. But the general vibe that comes with these relations, that somehow these are the relations that are responsible for making more complex or more derivative stuff out of simpler and more fundamental stuff. That's the basic idea behind these relations. And the question that I'm interested in is whether there's a generalization of the question of iterated grounding that might also be causing problems. I formulated this as the iterated determination question. It goes like this. Take some entities x and y and some determination relation d such that x d's y. Question, what's the z such that z bears d to x's and y's instantiation of d? When I use the phrase x's and y's instantiation of d, that's a deliberately ambiguous phrase, like many words that end with the Latin suffix -tion. It's ambiguous between different things. So x's and y's instantiation of d, that could refer to a d instance. So if you're a trope theorist, or if you think that there are both properties and relations and their instances, then x's and y's instantiation of d, it could refer to this one particular d instance. It could also refer to something like a representational thing that represents how x and y instantiate d. So it could be the fact of x bearing d to y. It could also be an event. It could also be the event of x is d-ing y. A bit more abstract, like I don't know, like Bob's kicking the ball, or this thing causing that thing, or this thing functionally realizing that thing. The question that this iterated determination question is asking is, suppose that x, y is d, is there something else that bears d to x is d-ing y? And of course, if there is, you can iterate it further. Suppose some z d's x is d-ing of y. Is there some w that these z's d-ing x is d-ing of y, and so on and so forth. Just quickly, why should you care about this question? So one reason, which is extremely generic and methodological, I think that questions of iteration are almost always interesting. This is something that was pointed out by Alan Hayek in his influential paper on philosophical heuristic. If you want to understand a concept, philosophically central concept better, you can also often learn a lot about it by just messing around and trying to see what happens when you apply it to itself. And indeed, we learned a lot about knowledge and supertask and metaphysical gizmos like instantiation by doing that. So the idea is maybe we can learn something about determination by doing that. A second motivation is many determination relations share certain theoretical roles with grounding. So learning whether those relations lead to a problematic regress could hopefully also shed some light on the structure of reality. And here's a third and more specific reason. Jessica Wilson influentially argued, especially in her no work for a theory of grounding, but also in some subsequent work, that the question of iterated grounding that I began with, that problem arises only because of what she calls the abstract nature of grounding. So on Wilson's view, grounding talk is very imprecise, and it could always in principle be replaced with talk of more specific determination relations. And when you hone in on those determination relations, this question of iterated grounding doesn't arise. So if there are iterated determination questions about relations other than grounding, that would show that Wilson is wrong about this. So that's a third motivation. So because I don't have, so I'm going to skip one part of this talk. Like I argue, among other things, that material constitution doesn't give rise to such a regress. This is not a very important part of the talk, because what I really want to show is that some relations do. So even if material constitution does too, and I'm wrong about this part, that would actually boost my thesis. So for that reason, I'm going to gracefully skip that part. Instead, what I want to focus on is functional realization. I think functional realization raises a regress problem that is just as bad as the question of iterated grounding. And I think that has significance for other issues as well. But for now, like, it also has some interesting repercussions for grounding. I won't have time to look into that. I'm just going to talk about realization today. So let's talk about functional realization. Functional realization is well known, especially in the philosophy of mind literature. It's often thought to be key in capturing the connection between the physical and the mental, but also more broadly between fundamental physical reality and basically everything else. So it's also supposed to be key to capturing the relation between the physical and the biological, the physical and the economic, and so on and so forth. In the metaphysically minded corner of this functional realization literature, there isn't much of a consensus on the relata of functional realization. I think it's safe to say that people who are just purely philosophers of mind don't fret a whole lot about it. People with more metaphysical inclinations varyingly assume that the relata are properties or property instances or perhaps events, or perhaps they are more liberal about it. Actually, as we are going to see, it matters a great deal for this regress what exactly the relata of realization are. So what I'm first going to do is, first I'm going to focus on the view that the relata of realization are property instances. I'm going to argue that if that's the case, then there's a regress problem about functional realization. And then I'm going to look at the alternative view, according to which the relata are just properties as types or universals, if you prefer, in which case, surprisingly, the regress doesn't arise. That's what I want to argue for. So let's start with, I think, the most popular view, that the relata of realization are property instances. So in this case, we can say that property instance F realizes property instance G. Let's say an instance of C5 firing. I mean, this is the most cliche example, but it's familiar. An instance of C5 firing realizes an instance of painfulness. That would be a typical case. So how does the regress arise? So I want to begin with by pointing out that if a property instance F realizes property instance G, then of course the realization relation holds between those property instances. But of course, not just the realization relation holds between those instances. An instance of the relation of realization also holds between those instances. So there's the relation between the instances, and there's an instance of the relation between those instances. So then we can naturally ask the question, assuming that G is multiply realizable, and F is one of its realizers, is R is just short for realization, is R, or to be more precise, this particular instance of realization between F and G, is that multiply realizable? Now, in the realization literature, realization is usually discussed with monadic properties in mind, and relations are discussed less, but there doesn't seem to be anything in the nature of realization that would prevent relations also from being multiply realizable. So just to give a quick example, predation is a relation. Predation seems to be multiply realizable. You know, predatorhood surely is multiply realizable. Very different sorts of things could be predators. I want to add also very different kinds of ordered pairs can instantiate the relation of predation. So it's an intelligible question to ask whether realization or an instance of realization is itself multiply realizable. Now, how can we settle this question, whether realization is multiply realizable? The best way I can think of is to consider whether realization bears certain marks of multiple realizability. So I'm not going to try to give a definition of multiple realizability, not the least because that's controversial. But there are certain marks which I think if a property or relation bears, that's a pretty strong sign that the property or relation in question is multiply realizable. So here are some marks of realization that I distinguished. The first one is physical diversity. So multiply realizable properties can be found in highly diverse systems. I mean, this is really just rehashing Putnam and Lewis and Fodor and these people. These systems show relatively little resemblance to one another with respect to low-level physical properties. And accordingly, such properties typically feature in the special sciences and not in fundamental physics. So typically, you find multiply realizable properties in chemistry, biology, economics, psychology, and not in quantum mechanics. So that's the first mark. Again, it's not necessarily in sufficient condition. It's marks of realization. The second is what we could call substrate dependence. Don't think of substratum in the medieval sense, in the property theoretic sense, more in the sense in which scientists sometimes use this word. The idea here is that the essence or the nature of a multiply realizable property lies in the pattern in which its bearers' components are arranged and the way in which those components work together. And what's important about a multiply realizable property is not the stuff of which the components in question are made. Right? So, you know, if pain is multiply realizable, then what really matters is not the atoms, you know, the nature of the atoms that make up pain sensing being. It's the way in which those atoms are structured, and possibly totally different atoms or totally different molecules could be structured in a similar way also to realize pain. And the third mark that I would like to distinguish is functional realizability. Multiply realizable properties are naturally characterized in functional terms, by which I mean something like in terms of abstractly defined rules, or maybe typical causes and effects, perhaps inputs or outputs, the different strands and brands of functionalism and theories of functional realization, but this seems to be common to them. So typically, multiply realizable properties and relations are not naturally characterized in terms of their intrinsic qualitative features. It's actually controversial if such properties even have an intrinsic qualitative nature, but to the extent that they do, that doesn't seem to be what's most important in the characterization. So again, I use the example of being a predator. Predator seems to satisfy all of these. It seems to bear all of these marks of multiple realizability. Now, next, I would like to say that realization itself bears the marks of multiple realizability. So let's just quickly go over these marks. So we have physical diversity. It seems like realization can be instantiated by pairs of entities that are physically very different from other pairs of entities that instantiate the realization relation. For example, an instance of zygote formation realizing an instance of reproduction, that's one instance of realization. An instance of, let's say, a brain state realizing a belief, that's another instance of realization. Those two seem physically diverse instances of realization. Second, we have substrate independence. The essence of realization lies in the way in which the roles or the causal features of the realizer relatum are related to the roles and the causal features of the realized relatum. It doesn't seem to matter what kind of stuff the physical system in which realization occurs is made of. It can occur in very different, very different substrates. Pairs of substrates could bear the realization relation. And third, we have functional realizability. Realization itself apparently can be characterized in functional terms. On all accounts of realization, functional realization seems to consist in a certain pattern of conferring causal powers from the realizer to the realized, or possibly the filling of a causal role of the realizer by the realized. So these are par excellence functional characterizations of realization. Again, the details matter greatly between different views. There are subset accounts of realization, and there are more like Ramsian, like role-playing accounts of realization. But this seems to be a common theme among them. So I want to say realization is multiply realizable, and then you get the realization token regress, what I call the realization token regress. So suppose that you have some property instance F, which bears an instance of realization R to property instance G. Hopefully I convinced you that realization is multiply realizable. So now we are looking for something that realizes R, which realizes this instance of realization. We can call that relation B. So B realizes realization. But now we have another instance of realization R plus. And because realization is multiply realizable, now we are looking for something that realizes R plus, which I call, like R star, which I call B star. So B star realizes R star. And we could call this third instance of realization between B star and R star star. And of course, that also requires a realizer, and so on and so forth ad infinitum. So it looks like the multiple realizability of realization lands us in a regress. And I'm not going to argue for this, but I think that with small modifications, you could also formulate this regress in terms of events or states as the realization relata. Sometimes realization fans treat those things as relata instead of property instances. So I think there's a realization token regress. Is the realization token regress problematic? Again, I don't like the word vicious. It has this really emotional flavor. I think you should care about it. That's all I'm saying. You should care about this regress. It seems to call for something smart to say about it. So is the realization token regress problematic? On the face of it, I would like to say that it's problematic. At least many realization physicalists put forth realization with very similar ambitions with which grounding physicalists put forward grounding. So realization is very often treated as this multi-purpose level connector, the glue that connects less fundamental bits of reality to fundamental physics. These are people like Terry Horgan and Andrew Melnick and Sidney Shoemaker have been treating it. And the regress suggests that that realization physicalism understood as the thesis that every instance of every property and relation is either physical or realized by some instance of or other of a physical property or relation. It seems like that thesis cannot be true because of instances of realization themselves, they are neither physical nor ultimately realized by a physical property or relation instance. Where admittedly it's a little bit vague what this ultimate realization means, but the idea is that you have this regress, so you never get rid of, you never get rid of instances of realization itself. You never get to a level when you only have not multiply realizable properties and relations. And I think similar remarks apply to other sweeping theses formulated in terms of realization. Now, here's the last bit. Do you get this regress if you think that realization is not a relation between property instances, but a relation between properties, period? And I, in a very encompassing way, I'm calling those properties types. I just call them types, not because of any Freudian connotations, but just to mean something very general. So you might think that properties are universals, but you might be some kind of nominalist. Even if you're a nominalist, you still want to have some way of distinguishing properties from their instances, and then you're going to give some kind of a story of what a property is. Maybe it's a class of instances, maybe it's a class of instances, some kind of construction out of possible words. Maybe it's a class of maximally resembling tropes, something like that. But so I'm just very encompassingly calling those things types, properties in the type sense. If that's the case, then strictly speaking, the realization relation R holds not between property instances, but between property types F and G. And notice that I'm using these bold letters. That's to distinguish property types from tokens. So when it's bold, it refers to a property type, and when it's not bold, it stands for one of its instances. So in that case, I'm not going to say every time bold B, because you can just read it, or bold this and that. So let's say realization is multiply realizable. Suppose B is one of its realizers. Now here's a crucial difference between this case and the previous case. When we looked at the token regress. In this case, the realization between B and R is just identical to the realization between F and G. So F bears the realization relation to G. B also bears the realization relation to R. But here, when we talk about realization, we are talking about realization in the type sense. It's numerically the same type that holds between F and G and B and R. And again, that type might be a universal, it might be a class of instances or something like that, but it's literally the same thing. It's literally the same thing. So, yeah, I mean, Thomas had these beautiful diagrams, and I've fallen the other extreme. But I think, I hope that this like hand-painted paint thing captures the main idea. So what you see here is, let's say F bears R to G, and I think the good way to visualize it is take the realizer of R. It's not just that B realizes R, but R is this weird relation that is being held to itself, is being born to itself by B. Okay, realization is realized by B, but that's just a way of saying that it's a relation that is being born to itself by B. And if you look for further iterations, it's going to keep getting looped back to itself, because it's going to be literally the same thing on the realized side of the relation. Now I want to say, I want to say this is why you don't get a regress. Now it's very natural to urge, at this point, no, like something seems to be missing, because there still seems to be a question in the vicinity that you can be asking in the type case, and which seems to give rise to a regress. So one way to ask this question is, well, but what realizes the realization that holds between B and R? So what realizes this instance of realization, or what realizes, I'm not asking what realizes realization, but what realizes realization on this occasion between B and R. And here the answer cannot be the same thing as between F and G. And here's what I wanna respond in this case. Imagine this with a foot stomping. So I think this is a misleading question because there's only one relation of realization in the type sense. That's the same relation between F and G and between B and R. Of course, B, which realizes realization, which holds between F and G, and B star, which holds between B and R, those may very well be different relations, although I don't think we can quite assume that, but those might be different relations. There might be different realization realizers. However, I still don't think there's a further question beyond just the unqualified question of what realizes realization, or what are the realizers of realization. I don't think there's a further question of what realizes realization between F and G as opposed to realization between B and realization, because in both cases we are just asking about the realizers of realization. There isn't a further entity, according to the view I'm considering, there isn't a further entity which is not the relation of realization and which is somehow specific to F and G and B and R, and whose realization status we can be inquiring about. Like, I think the thing you would naturally imagine there would be an instance, but on the view I'm considering, there are no such things as instances. The only sense in which there are instances is ordered pairs of individuals that instantiate the relation. There isn't a further question that we could be asking about this case of realization and that case. The word case smuggles back tropes or property or relation instances through the back door, but on the view I'm considering, there are no such things. There are just individuals, properties, and relations. So I want to say this, there's no such thing that these phrases speak out, and about which the question can be legitimately asked in such a way as to give rise to the regress that I considered in the token case. And I ran out of time, so I'm going to stop here. But the upshot is, I think there's an interesting regress about functional realization. And I also think it's interesting that whether that regress arises turns on superficially very nitpicky in-house issues about the relata of the realization relation. Thank you.